Hi, everybody. Welcome to ABC News Live. I'm Whit Johnson. Thanks so much for joining us. Some exciting stuff happening on Capitol Hill today. Music icon Smokey Robinson and some other legendary artists were testifying on Capitol Hill today. They're trying to convince senators to vote for the Music Modernization Act. And Robinson basically arguing that some of the rules that are in place allows for some loopholes, and musicians are suffering, some of them not being compensated in a way that they should be due to some old laws that are still in place. Let's take a listen to part of what Smokey Robinson had to say during that hearing this morning. Take a listen.
The records of the 50s and 60s aren't called classics because of their age. They're called classics because of their greatness. They still resonate today. They define the American sound.
And Robinson there trying to protect the musicians who created some of those classics, including himself and some of his colleagues. Let's go to Capitol Hill. ABC's Arlette Saenz was there inside the room during the hearing. And Arlette, they're calling this is the protecting and promoting music creation of the 21st century. What exactly is this about? What are senators considering right now?
Well, Smokey Robinson traded his spot on the concert stage for a seat at a congressional hearing today, trying to convince lawmakers to support this bill. So this bill does a number of things. One thing it does is create a digital licensing system, which would change the way that digital streaming services license songs, as well as the way that royalties are paid to songwriters. And one issue that Smokey Robinson really was concerned about was the fact that copyright laws right now only cover songs that were made post-1972. So think of Smokey Robinson and the Miracles and songs like I Second That Emotion or Tears of a Clown. Those are not covered under current copyright laws. And Smokey Robinson talked a little bit about that today, saying why he and others who created music before 1972 should be compensated. Take a listen.
The Miracles was one of the very first acts signed to Motown in 1957. We recorded the label's first million-selling hit, Shop Around, in 1960. Second Emotion in 1967, and Tears of a Clown in 1970. Those happen to be some of the biggest records I've ever been associated with, and to not be paid because they were prior to 1972 is ludicrous as far as I'm concerned. A lot of work went into making those songs, not just from the artists, but from the musicians and the writers and the people, the producers and people who were involved in making them, and they deserve to be compensated. Musicians who recorded before February 15th, 1972 deserve to be compensated the same way as those who recorded after that date. Starting at the beginning of 2016, I decided that I was going to audit everybody, which I did. I audited everybody that was a source of income for me. I audited everyone. Now, two of the larger companies, I audited them, and one of them, it turns out that according to the audit that was done by professional auditors and stuff, they owed me $250,000. They told me they would give me $12,000, okay? And if I wanted to fight them, then bring it on. So now, even in my position economically and whatever, how could I put myself to fight a company like that for 20 years? And you're talking about an artist who is not, who doesn't have the financial wherewithal perhaps that I would have or something. Fighting a company like that or trying to sue somebody, that's out of the question. So we need your help. We need this. We need the Senate. We need you guys to come to the rescue.
So Smokey Robinson estimates that his songs are played over 50,000 times on the radio and streaming services each day. So if you're in your car listening, you know, they have channels that are like the 50s on 5 or 60s on 6. Those songs are not necessarily covered under current copyright protections. And so what this bill would do, it would extend those protections and make sure that songwriters and recording artists who made these songs, like I Second That Emotion, or think of My Girl, that's a classic, Smokey Robinson Robinson wrote that song, that the Temptations sang it. They're not getting compensation. This bill would ensure that they would be protected and get compensation for those songs. Smokey Robinson was arguing that there's many people who aren't fortunate enough as he to still be recording music and still be touring. He's 78 years old. He's still out on that concert stage. He says that this would ensure that artists of an older generation would be able to get compensated for their work. The bill also would make sure that sound engineers and mixers and producers, that they could apply for a share of these royalties, something that they're not always guaranteed right now.
And Arlette, this is mostly considered a bipartisan bill. Where does it stand right now? What are its chances of passing? What are the holdups here?
Well, the House actually passed a similar version of this bill last month. You have Republicans and Democrats championing this bill. One person is Senator Orrin Hatch. A little known fact about him is that he's a songwriter himself. So this is of a particular importance to Senator Hatch. It's unclear when exactly the Senate Judiciary Committee might mark up this bill in the committee, but I expect you do have both sides of the aisle eager to help musicians, and that this has a good chance going forward.
Arlette, what was the reception like? These senators in the presence of these music icons, we could see some of them fanboy and fangirling over some of these musicians there.
Yeah, there was definitely a lot of fangirling and fanboying going on. You had senators posting photos of Instagram of themselves hugging Smokey Robinson before the hearing. He had people, the senators actually spoke and delivered their remarks. You had people using Smokey Robinson puns. So, for instance, Senator Kamala Harris of California, when she was urging lawmakers to support this bill, she told them that she was asking them to second that emotion. That drew some laughs in the crowd. You also, in addition to Smokey Robinson, you had Dionne Warwick, you had Darlene Love, and you had one of the founders of the Supremes. So there was a lot of celebrity and star power at this hearing, and the senators were gushing over it and kind of taken away by it too.
All right, Arlette Science for us on Capitol Hill. Thanks so much for your insight there. A little peek behind the scenes, what was going on during that hearing. We want to bring in Mike Muse as well, our pop culture, music, political expert, to take a bigger picture at this, because, you know, for folks who are watching this at home, they say, okay, well, this impacts, you know, some of these older musicians, but what does this mean for the broader music industry?
Yeah, well, one, Arlette did a fantastic job of covering it. I had the chance to watch it on television, and it was really cool to watch. And so I watched a lot of like those Senate subcommittee hearings on C-SPAN, and so this was the more interesting ones to watch. And Smokey Robinson, what a legend, right?
Yeah.
And so it was cool to watch him in action and his control of the subject and his knowledge of the subject.
He spoke so well of the issue and explained it clearly in a way that I thought that, you know, was great for the senators and even average folks watching at home to understand.
He did, Whit. He really humanized it, right? Because what we're talking about is a very technical, is very wonky. And so he being there allowed for this humanization from the artist's perspective. So there's a couple things at play here. So there's a Classical Music Act, and then there's a Music Modernization Act, right? And so what the Classical Act does is allows individuals and artists pre-1972 to be allowed to have a share of the pot, if you will, right? And so it's bringing them up to speed so they can participate in the revenue sharing in terms of publishing and copyrights, et cetera. But then what happens is then you bring them along to the Music Modernization Act side now, and allows them to have access to the digital stream. So now we're talking about your Spotify, now we're talking about your titles, now we're talking about your Pandoras, to allow them to participate. Because as it stands now, they are now left out of the sharing and the revenue sharing of that publishing rights now on Spotify.
So groups like the Miracles being able to access some of these new platforms.
Exactly.
Okay.
And good point, Whit. So what's happening is their music is on some of these platforms right now, but there is no law that requires those digital streaming platforms to actually pay the Miracles for their songs. So it's almost for artists like Smokey Robinson, the Miracles is a two-pronged step. One, this allows their music to be into the copyright conversation by law to participate in revenue sharing, and then from there it takes into the Modernization Act. So now on digital streaming platforms, they now have a participation sharing of it. Now, to be fair, there are some digital streaming platforms that already are opting to pay these artists for revenue streaming, but it levels the playing field and makes it equal.
What do you think the holdup has been all these years? I mean, we're talking about a law from the 70s still in place. Why do you think these loopholes have been holding for so long?
It's economics and it's a money play. So there's a small loophole that a lot of corporations have decided to take advantage of. And the loophole stems from the federal government laws versus the state laws. So the state laws allow for these copyrights to be paid, but there's a loophole in the federal government law system that doesn't require for them to do it, because then you're at odds. Is it state versus federal versus state, what trumps what, and then who has discretion, if you will. And so now that loophole is now in existence, now this act closes a loophole. But you have to think about it, Whit. There's so many competing interests, right? So you have your songwriters, your producers, right? You have your performers, but then you also have your record label execs, right? And then you have owners, so think Silicon Valley, who own these new digital platforms and streamings. And so everyone wants a piece of the pie. And so when you have that many competing interests, how then do you neutralize the situation so that all outcomes can be equitable? And so now we're at a point now where this bill is that all the outcomes hopefully will be equitable. But with something to really pay attention to, what we didn't hear come out of the hearing right now, and I'm hoping, as Arnett mentioned, during the markup period of this bill, that we'll get to terminations agreements, right? Because Smokey hit on a couple of things about economics. And so he was saying that he had a lot of these companies audited, and it cost him $250,000 just to have it audited. For an artist like that, imagine those who didn't have the type of success that Smokey Robinson had. They may not have the current income and revenue streams, really fight it in court.
So would this legislation solve the problems, though, or are there still other battles that need to play out in the years ahead?
There's still other battles that need to play out in the years ahead. And the second part, what part of the battle, what Smokey was alluding to, partly was termination rights. So as it stands right now, there's 30 years that a record label can own the song or the product of an artist. After that, the rights expire, but then the artist then has to engage and exercise their right in order for them to receive their music back to them, so they can negotiate better fair pay and more equitable contracts, if you will. Think about this, though, Whit. The only person who was successfully able to get himself out of that was Prince. So to this day, Prince is the only one who was able to successfully exercise his right to end his termination agreement so that he can own all of his materials and he can negotiate better deals to make it more equitable. Why is that important, you may be wondering? And to the listeners at home, think about those artists back from the 1970s and 1960s, right, who really just had a hope, didn't have any social economical means to have great lawyers to negotiate on their behalf for contracts. We all know they probably got the short end of the deal, right? And so if this amendment goes into markup and then you put termination clauses in there, it will allow for other artists who's been marginalized and been sitting on the margins even prior to their contract being signed to be able to, you know what, take their ownership back, take their product, take their property, take their intellectual capital back, and then renegotiate for better fare and for better pay.
Mike, stand by for a second. I believe Arlette is still with us. It'd be great if we could go back to her just for a moment on Capitol Hill, because we're talking about the likelihood that this could pass through the Senate and ultimately become law. Have we heard anything from the White House on this? I mean, is this something that if the senators say okay and they sign off on this Music Modernization Act, that this is something that could actually be signed into law in the near future?
No, this isn't something that the White House has been out there commenting on, but we can certainly ask. But we know that this is going to be going through the Senate Judiciary Committee, and it will be going through a markup. So there could be changes to the legislation made to try to get some other folks on board. And, you know, you didn't just have people up there at that hearing today talking about why this should be passed. There was also a woman with a public interest group saying that there are some changes that need to be made to this legislation. She was arguing that this would extend copyrights for about 144 years, meaning that these songs would be out of the public domain, and that's actually not in the public interest. So the committee will be hearing both sides of these arguments as they mark up this legislation and try to get it to the full Senate for a vote and over to the White House for the president to sign.
Arlette, that's a really interesting point. I want to bring Mike back into the conversation. What about this argument that, you know, that this isn't perfect, that there are issues that need to be solved moving forward?
Yeah, I'm so glad Arlette brought that up, because I also want to mention that too as well. And so she's right, the Senate has to do a markup, but for example, the term agreement, that's going to come up in the House. So there is a representative from California, actually, with your home state, who is considering bringing up this amendment for the term agreement. But what she's talking about, her name was Wesley Rose, and so she actually comes from the Public Knowledge Institute. And so what she was talking about the public domain is that she believes that the years for this music to be into the public domain is too long. And so not only just for the current contemporary modern acts and artists, but she also wants those pre-1972 to be able to allow to be on the same threshold, if you will, when their music can get released in the public domain. And that's important with is because it allows for the study, right? So think about scholars, think about academics, think about those who want to understand the origins of music, right? And so that's an age-old debate that we have at brunch, at dinner, at the bar. So where did rock and roll come from, right? Who invented it? Who invented blues, right? So if you have all this music pre-1972, you can really begin to understand the study and the migration patterns of blues, right? It come from the Delta of Mississippi. It moved north in the migration pattern to Chicago, and that's when blues and jazz and this great Creole music that kind of got mixed in. But having that in the public domain from pre-1972 allows us to begin to study that and create white papers and research so we can begin to answer those questions of where did this music come from, who created it, when, where, and how.
All right, I want to bring Arlette back in just one more time. I know you got to run to do some other things. We saw some of the senators taking selfies with Smokey Robinson and some of the other artists. That must have been quite the scene on Capitol Hill today.
Yeah, you don't have celebrities up here very often, but oftentimes when they are up here, you do see lawmakers and senators kind of gushing over it. So I think you had Senator Orrin Hatch, who's also a fellow songwriter. He posted on his social media accounts some photos with him. Senator Graham of South Carolina, he also posted some photos. So it was a fun scene up here to have such a legend like Smokey Robinson, who so many of us have listened to for generations up here on the Hill.
All right, Arlette, thank you so much for your time. We appreciate it again, attending that hearing and bringing us all that information. Mike, I want to bring back one more question, though, too. Of course. To bring it back
I love the subject. So
yes, absolutely. Yeah. To bring it back to the average Joe music consumer, right? What does this do for access in the future if something like this were to pass?
Those are fantastic questions. So it's allowing for the consumer, if you're a fan of music, both just from a historical perspective, understanding context, it allows those pre-1972s to be more in the domain, and it allows more equity so you can hear it more broadly on different platforms, because now these platform owners, if you will be more comfortable having this music on their systems. Now they know there's equitable ways that they can be paid, because they have a seat at the table too as well. So part of these two acts allows for a committee to be established in order to determine what the pay rate should be, right? So now you have everyone at the table determining these fair rates. So now as a consumer, I can hopefully one day go to almost every distribution content platform that I enjoy to hear music from the past that I also loved. But also too, what's happening right now is that it allows those that we don't talk about often, those names you don't hear of, and those are the songwriters, those are the sound engineers, those are the producers. As it stands now, they're making fractions on the penny to the dollar on places like Spotify and like Tidal. This now allows them to come into the current and allows them to see at the table to negotiate better compensation patterns for them. What's happening now is that most music, most artists, vocal artists, if you will, they'll use these streaming platforms to create their brand in order to get booked for festivals like Coachella, Lollapalooza, South by Southwest. But who don't you see on the stage? The producers, the sound engineers, the songwriters, so they're not being paid for it. So the artists, the vocal performers have found a way to get compensated where the songwriters can't. So the Modernization Act, which is the part 2 of this, now allows those individuals to have a participating share of the revenue on these sites. So it's great for the consumer, great for the songwriter, those who are invisible, those who don't hear and talk about, and it's really great for those historians to really understand the context of music.
Mike Muse, it's great to have this conversation with you. It's an interesting day on Capitol Hill, considering all the politics out there. This is maybe something that doesn't get as much attention, but Smokey Robinson, we're like, wait a minute, what's going on here? Taking a deeper look at something that impacts a lot of people in the music we listen to.
It is.
So Mike, thanks so much. I do want to go, as Arlette was talking about some of those tweets, if we can show some of the pictures there. We don't have those pictures, but again, Orrin Hatch and Senator Lindsey Graham taking selfies. Exactly. So again, thank you so much for joining us. This is ABC News Live. My name is Whit Johnson. You can follow this story and all of the stories we're covering on ABC News on abcnews.com and download our ABC News app. I'm Whit Johnson. Have a great day.